Noted.
You didn't write out the number and Kurtzon's name yet, did you?
Well, it's the witching hour of 7 p.m. I'd like to call this Lakewood City Council study session for Monday,
11:20?
June 22nd to order. The first item for discussion is a review of police department policies and procedures. For this, we have Chief Zarro.
Okay, good evening, Mayor Anderson and council members. Give me 1 second. I'm going to get my screen share going while I talk with you a little bit about what I hope to accomplish here. Okay, Mayor Anderson, are you seeing the agenda for tonight? Okay.
We see the agenda. I was on mute. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I think I'll have a little more success with technology tonight than the last time. Mayor Anderson and council members, tonight I'm just presenting for a bit of a review our manual standards, sometimes referred to as our policies and procedures or our policy manual, and also separately our use of force policy. Now it is, if you've had a chance to look at it, you'll see it's a lengthy document. So my goal tonight, or my plan, wasn't to go through it page by page, but just give a little bit of a history of the document, how it's used, and then answer any questions that you might have. First, the document itself is going back to when we were founded as a police department in 2004. Chief Saunders at the time kind of borrowed different manuals from different departments and pieced them together for what would work for us. Very early on, and for years, we would see typos with references to Federal Way and Auburn and the leftover bits from where we had borrowed from other agencies. As I scroll down, oh, and it's important to note too that this is a living document. Nothing is etched in stone. We make changes, review and make changes to the document as needed, either as required by law or best practices, or just what works for the department, or we'll remove something that doesn't work or is outdated. As I scroll down through the table of contents, you can see there's it covers quite a few different topics. Everything from operational matters to just standards of conduct. Where I'll stop first is just that under 1.1, the law enforcement agency role, and 1.1.2 are codes of conduct. Now, whenever we have an internal affairs investigation, or most of the time when we have an internal affairs investigation, the manual standards section that is suspected to have been violated is under this code of conduct. And as I scroll down, you'll see it contains things like Ordinance 12 laws, personal conduct or conduct unbecoming, truthfulness. These are all, like I said, the conduct related standards that department members have to adhere to. A lot of the other sections are largely administrative, and so violations of those aren't as frequent. But when we look at conduct is generally what we investigate in an internal affairs investigation or professional standards investigation, and those conducts codes are found here. And as you can see, just the code of conduct part goes on for quite a ways. So it's definitely a big document that contains a lot of information. What I want to do next, and I could certainly answer questions whenever you'd like, but what I wanted to do next is jump to our use of force policy. And this, let me reduce it a little bit. This is the document that governs our use of force. You'll see a lot of references to state and federal law and to case law throughout this document. And this is where we find things like our reasonableness standard and the definitions of what necessary means. And when you're talking about use of force, it needs to be necessary, and that's actually found in RCW. And what, as you read through it, what you'll see a lot of it comes back to, whether it's state law or case law, is a reasonableness standard. And even if you look at what's necessary, it's that no reasonably effective alternative to the use of force appeared to exist, and the amount of force used was reasonable to effect the lawful purpose intended. So you'll see that word throughout this policy a lot, because that's what we find in state law and also in case law. It provides for definitions, you'll see, but it provides for factors that should be considered by the officers using force, but also by those reviewing the use of force afterwards for appropriateness and whether it's within policy. And you'll see things like the conduct of the individual being confronted, the different factors or physical factors of the officer versus the person they're dealing with, the physical size. If the officer is greatly outsized, that could make a difference in what type of force or the level of force they use. And things like the proximity of weapons, what's known to the officer at the time as far as the history, the violent history of the suspect. There's all those factors that go into, or we expect to go into, the decision to use force. And then you'll see here what's defined as excessive force. And I've heard in different presentations that I've given and even listened to news reports and others, reference to excessive force and almost using that term in lieu of deadly force. Excessive force, by definition, is we shouldn't be using. It's force that is not necessary. It's like it sounds. It's excessive. So I've actually been asked the question, how do we decide to use excessive force? Well, we don't. We shouldn't be deciding to use excessive force. By definition, that excessive force is beyond what was reasonable and what was necessary. And then as it moves down, you'll see it gets into deadly force and some of the conditions surrounding deadly force and the requirements. And it does cover the discharge of firearms other than just in cases of deadly force in training or to euthanize an animal that's been seriously injured. Or you'll also see to perform forensic testing. Warning shots is in 1.3.3, you'll see there, we don't allow warning shots. We never have. It's just because you don't know where that round's gonna go. You should certainly never fire one up into the air. And even if you shoot one at the ground, it's possible to ricochet and hit something that was unintended to be hit. So warning shots have always been banned and not allowed here at the Lakewood Police Department. And that's pretty universal, at least in our region, that warning shots are not allowed. And as we scroll down a little bit further, we get into our less lethal force, and that's less lethal is a term used to describe that amount of force that's just under deadly force. And that's where we're using tools like a a baton or a taser or LVNR, those types of things, or an impact round, something like that is considered less lethal. It covers the, here we require what we call a ranged less lethal tool to be carried by all officers. And that's something like a taser or like pepper spray, so that they do have another option to create that can be used over distance, not great distance, obviously, but used over some distance, 10 to 15 feet even, so that they have that tool available to them, as opposed to not having that and needing to use some level of force and potentially resorting to deadly force. And we do reference OC spray here and impact weapons, and I can tell you that both of those are rarely used. Even if we look back, over 10 years, and I pulled these numbers earlier, I think we had impact weapons used a total of 13 times, and OC spray used a total of, I think, 6 times, again, over the course of 10 years. It's rare that those are ever used. But there are situations where they can be a useful tool. You can see the taser is, the section on taser is pretty extensive. And then we get into the vascular neck restraint. Used to be referred to as the lateral vascular neck restraint. And I'll be quite honest, I don't know why the lateral was removed a few years ago, but it's been, and that's not just us, that as a profession, the L was removed. So it's just referred to as vascular neck restraints. We do have this as a tool for our officers. You have to be trained in it. You have to be certified to be able to do it. And that training includes having it applied to you and you applying it to an instructor. So you have a very good knowledge of how it's used and what it does before it's used. And I know in a lot of recent conversations, we've heard reference to chokeholds. Those, we look at those, one, they're considered deadly force, but we consider chokeholds to be those, here it refers to bar arm type chokes that compress the airways. Vascular neck restraints restrict the blood flow on the sides of the neck, and are not considered, generally not considered deadly force, and have a low risk of injury or death to the person it's being applied to. Chokeholds, by our definition, are those that restrict the airway, and that is considered deadly force, and we don't train that, and that should only be used if you're seriously, your life is in danger, or the life of somebody else, and that is your only option. One of the things I'll ask is that if, as you hear conversations regarding any type of neck restraint, just know that there is that difference between, at least from our perspective, a chokehold that restricts the airway and vascular neck restraints that restricts the blood flow on the sides. So my concern as we look at different legislation that's being talked about is it creates ambiguity, and that's what's worse than restriction is leaving, creating laws that leaves ambiguity or room for interpretation. So those are our interpretations or definitions of both the chokehold and the vascular neck restraint. And I can tell you in our uses of the vascular neck restraint, and again, in the last 10 years, we've had just over 80 no injuries, no significant injuries. In all cases, they were seen by a doctor or reviewed by medical staff. And the doctors that we've talked to there are times when they've said that's not really necessary, but in an abundance of caution, that's what we do. And again, that's, I've talked before about how seldom we actually use force. This is a fraction of that fraction. And I've talked before too about what triggers a use of force report, where an officer writes a submits a different report documenting just the use of force on any given incident. And these bullet points here are what trigger that. It's any use of physical strength, skill, or pain techniques that result in a visible injury or complaint of injury. So even somebody complaining that they think they're injured, that requires it. Any use of physical strikes, that would be a punch or a kick. Any less lethal weapon that I identified earlier, a baton or OC or a taser. If you have multiple officers required to overcome resistance. So even if it, it's just fairly mild, but you need two officers, the strength of two officers to do that, that would trigger the report. Any technique where it takes a person to the ground, or anytime multiple officers, well, I guess that's in there twice. What we tried to capture is what if somebody was watching, what would they think is considered a use of force? Just any citizen, not what an officer would consider a use of force, but just some citizen watching. And that's what we tried to capture with those bullet points. And on top of that, we encourage, or have for the past few years, encouraged officers to over-report rather than under-report. Or if there's any question at all, it's better to report than not. There's supervisory reports or reports to the supervisor, and then the written reports also that go along with it. And it's referenced in here too, the use of taser by animal control officers. That is strictly for self-defense because they don't take people into custody. So that's if they get into a situation where retreat is not an option, but their safety is at risk. And I don't know that we have ever had an animal control officer need to use their taser. But it is there if they do get into that situation where they're unable to retreat. Now, and I mentioned earlier that this is a living document, and this is one section of the larger manual standards. And a couple of the changes that we've made over the past couple of years, one regarding vehicle pursuits, we restricted what they're pursued for, what pursuits are allowed for. The other is like adding the part to the use of force reporting requirement if two officers are needed to overcome the subject resistance. Things like that have been added in recent years. And some of it might come from accreditation as well. There's times when we go to our reaccreditation that there's new policies that they require that we will implement those new policies. So even, so that's every 3 or 4 years, I guess, that there's that review that takes place and we occasionally have to make changes to our policies. And for those of you that remember when we went through CALIA accreditation, we actually had made extensive changes to our policies to meet the CALIA standards. So with that, you see, I scroll up, there's also, we're looking at getting into the Special Response Team or SRT procedures manual. This is something that that applies just to SRT and what policies or what practices they adhere to. They also still follow our larger manual standards. So all those conduct requirements are still need to be adhered to, even though they're on, performing a special function. So like I said, I wasn't going to go through the entire thing page by page because it is such a big document, but that's kind of a quick rundown of a little bit of the history of the document, some of the chapters and sections that we refer to the most, and then going over the use of force policy a little bit as well. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Whalen.
Thank you. I've got a series of questions that I think, Chief, are some are softballs to get the conversation rolling on some of these issues, and maybe some are just questions that I have in my own mind, but I'll start with the context by which we come to this conversation tonight. We've had a couple of rough months, if not weeks, involving national issues, looking with some scrutiny on police departments and council members helping set policy with regard to how community policing is conducted. So the first question I want to ask you that lays a little bit of the groundwork for what is currently topical is section 1.29 on bias-based profiling. And so I was pleased to see that particular policy statement enunciated in the manual. But my question to you is, how often do we conduct this kind of training? Page 17 of our packet tonight, folks, if you're looking for it.
So the training it's been, I guess, variable frequency over the years. There's times when we would do it every year, times when we do it every couple of years. I think it's been a few since we've brought some in. But some of that too is recently, I know for me, I was waiting to see what CJTC was going to be putting out in light of I-940 and what they mandated there.
It seems it would be, from my perspective, it might be something where we tweak the manual perhaps to say, everybody newly hired receives this training upon entry into the LPD, and the training is reviewed periodically, whatever is reasonable by way of CALIA or other standards. I would think at least once a year by every member of the department might be appropriate, maybe more often, I'm not sure, but it's something I think we should look at on that standard. Because we want to have some sort of a checklist, I would think, in our employment file or however you maintain it, that, Sergeant John Smith received the training on X date, and we just kind of keep track of that to make sure that it's done. The other series of questions as I get into it is all involve the use of force. And so when I look at sections 1.2.7, and it discusses and defines use of discretion. It's defined as the freedom to make decisions or latitude of choice within certain legal bounds. You got to take into consideration best interests of the public, mitigating circumstances, etc. But then when we go over to 1.3.2, when we talk about use of force and how it's viewed, there's a discussion there that the use of force is held to an objectively reasonable standard based on the totality of the facts. So I wonder sometimes if there could be some confusion to the brand new person coming on board as to whether his exercise of discretion is his own subjective exercise, or whether he's adequately trained that his exercise of discretion must be viewed under the lens of an objectively reasonable standard. And so when we get into that, I wonder if in the independent review of uses of force down the road, whether it may behoove us to think about body cams as a tool to assist in the independent review, because a picture may be worth 1,000 words for the benefit of the officer and or the benefit of the public, to ensure that that use of force, when viewed under an objectively reasonable standard, it takes a little bit away from the subjective after the fact review on the report, maybe by the officer involved or maybe by a witness of the officer or partner involved. So, what's your thought on that? How would the use of body cams assist or detract, A, from the operation, and B, from the reporting and determination of the use as objectively reasonable?
Well, there's a couple things to consider with that. One, a camera, no matter what angle or where it's at or who's wearing it, will never capture what an officer thinks and feels, right, or what they perceive. It can capture some physical movements, but it's impossible for a camera to capture what an officer feels, whether that's fear, what they perceive, or maybe a movement that wasn't picked up on camera or was just outside the field of view or field of vision. The other thing to consider with body cameras, and when we specifically when we talk about use of force, we're not a lot of the conversations that I'm hearing right now aren't about what's objectively reasonable. It's about what looks bad. And I've used this term before, that there is no such thing as an aesthetically pleasing use of force.
Right.
No matter how justified it is.
Right.
If you look at it on video over and over again, it's going to shock people, and it's going to, not look reasonable just because it doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good to watch. So that from that perspective, I don't think it would necessarily contribute to the objectively reasonable part. Now, there are times when it can show physical movements that confirm what the officer said.
Mm-hmm.
There are times when the audio recordings can record what directions were given, what questions were asked, and what was said. That I think there is no, I don't think they're going to fix everything, and I don't think they're all bad either. I think you just have to take the good with the bad, and it's just kind of.
But do you think it could be an effective tool to assist? And I'm not talking about having video because it never looks pretty for the sake of, people getting their hands on it and throwing it on CNN like we've seen. My question to you is whether it would be an effective tool to an independent reviewing agency under I-940 to help determine, for the officer's benefit, the department's benefit, as well as the public's benefit, whether or not all the factors that the officer utilized in making the decision were in fact objectively reasonable, as best they can determine from that one tool. It's not the be all and end all, but it could be a tool.
Well, that's provided the reviewing panel is objective. I think it could be a tool to do that, with the understanding that it still doesn't record emotion. It doesn't record what's felt or by the officer or thought.
Right. So on the subject of less lethal force or lethal force, and we talked about VNR being one of the tools under that section of the manual under less lethal force. So we've used, at least we've documented 80 instances of VNR use in the last 10 years with no injuries, which is good. My question to you is, do we even need it as a tool?
Well, when we start taking tools away, especially very useful tools, then we limit what the officers can do and what they can resort to. And VNR really does equalize a lot of those factors, the size and strength factors that I talked about. A smaller officer can control a larger suspect with a VNR. So,
are you aware of any jurisdictions that are eliminating that tool?
I'm sorry.
Are you aware of any jurisdictions locally that are eliminating that tool in their review of their manual?
Well, I know Bellevue did, but they've, I think they eliminated all neck restraints, or I don't know if they call it chokehold or neck restraints. But there are some that I think Tacoma did. I think they restricted it for at least a year, but I don't know. We train it as well. Some of the jurisdictions I've heard, I'm not saying this is Tacoma or Bellevue, but I've heard that they are eliminating them, but they didn't use them to begin with. So they were banning something that they didn't train in and they didn't use to begin with.
In your opinion, how would removal of that tool impact the operation of Lakewood Police Department?
Well, there's 80 incidents over the last 10 years that the officers would have had to resort to something more intrusive or something that with a higher risk of injury.
Maybe, or less, right? I mean, it's on the panoply of less lethal force.
Right.
Yep, that's all I have for right now. I just want to try to throw some thoughts out there and questions for discussion by the group. Thank you.
Mr. Brandstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Chief, I appreciate the deputy mayor's questions that covered some of the areas that I had, but I wanted to ask you two things. In standard 1-3 and 1.3, and I'm on page 18, there's a quote, and from RCW 1031-050 that's sort of put into policy, and it says on page 18, if after notice of the intention to arrest the defendant, he either flees or forcibly resists, the officer may use all necessary means to effect the arrest. And I'm wondering if you could, that's the quote from the RCW. And it's in the manual, but you know, that quote is not, doesn't reference whether it's a shoplifter or a robbery suspect or something else. I mean, within the department, what kind of guidance is there that's not written in the policy manual that sort of limits the situations that this particular statement applies? Does it apply to all, only to felonies, or all gross misdemeanors or misdemeanors, or I'm trying to put a fence around that statement.
Well, one of the things to consider is the word necessary that's in there. And then you go back to what the RCW defines as necessary is, you know, reasonably effective alternative appear to exist. And that again is the term reasonable. And some of the things to consider too is I know it talks about, there's reference a lot to the type of crime, but if somebody commits a shoplift and then as they're running out, they point a gun at the officer or somebody and then takes off, that the underlying crime might have been a shoplift, but they escalated it, the risk that they present through their subsequent behavior. So it's the reasonableness of what the officer's faced with, the actions as much as it is the underlying crime. But it's, again, the quote was all necessary means, but the word necessary has that definition that's rooted in reasonableness.
I'm yes, but then the necessary is an officer decision.
Well, at the time the force is used, and then the review is by everybody in the chain of command that reviews it. And that's everybody else. It's the first line supervisor, the sergeant, the lieutenant, and the assistant chief, and people in professional standards that all review it. And it's they're looking at it for what was it reasonable.
Okay. Thanks. Then on page 202 of our packet, there is a discussion about the inquiries that are made into an incident involving whether an officer is adhered to the standards, and it goes to where it's confirmed that he didn't, can't be resolved. But the last thing over there is the finding that an inquiry can make is standards failure. And I'm not, could I get an understanding of what that means, and maybe an example of where that's been a finding in the past, and what happens then?
So the standards failure might be something where there's an allegation that the officer did something wrong in a given incident. We review it and we find that, you know, by letter of the law, by letter of the policy, the officer did violate that policy, but what they did was right. And it met our values and it was legal, then our policy is flawed. And so that's a policy failure or a standards failure. Conversely, you can have an officer that did something that fit this little window where it didn't necessarily violate our policy in any way, but it didn't meet our values either. and wasn't behavior that we wanted from an officer. So because we didn't have a policy, that could be a standards failure as well. And in either case, we would want to adjust the standard to meet the behavior that we want. And I can't give you an example that I think we have had one, but off the top of my head, I can't give an example.
In a couple of places in the manual of 400 pages or whatever, there occasionally there was some text in red. Are those edits being considered, edits that have already been implemented? What was?
Those were
in the living document, yeah.
I believe edits that had already been implemented, but we didn't take the red off.
Okay. And I think that's all I've got for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a few questions, Chief. I've heard some discussion that the just generally in law enforcement, rank and files attitude and outlook on cameras, whether body cameras or dash cameras, has evolved over the last 10 years, so that a substantially larger portion of the rank and file feel there might be advantages to cameras, since now it appears, at least in the press, that they're guilty until proven innocent, and they'd like a camera to say, you know, no, yes, the guy wasn't sitting there with his arms up saying, yes, sir, officer, I'll do anything you say. Actually, he was coming at him. Have you noticed any change in that regard?
I'd say a little bit, and where what I hear consistently from agencies that have gone to body cams is that the officers are reluctant at first, but after they have them, they don't want to give them up. Because more often than not, they are used to vindicate an officer's actions than anything else.
Currently in Oregon, there's pending legislation regarding limitations on the power of what in Washington would be PERC arbitrators. And it looks like after a substantial log jam that rather heavily liberal legislature may in fact adopt legislation in a special session that limits an arbitrator's ability to lessen discipline if misconduct is upheld. So if an officer is terminated for misconduct, the arbitrator, for example, couldn't reduce that discipline based on a procedural defect if the arbitrator finds at the arbitration that the misconduct actually did occur. Do you know of any movement on the part of police chiefs, administrators associations to advance anything like that in the state of Washington?
Nothing as significant as that. There's some discussion about what that would look like for officers that are found to have violated or committed serious misconduct. But nobody wants to completely abandon due process for officers either, which in some cases that's the direction that people are talking. But there might be a middle ground there somewhere, but I haven't heard anybody that's found it yet.
So yeah, my questions are kind of disjointed, so don't try to ascribe a train of thought to this. At one point we pursued and attained CALIA accreditation, which for the uninitiated or was the Commission and something like the Commission of Law Enforcement Standards Association or something along that line.
Commission on an accreditation for Law Enforcement Association.
But we abandoned that more more along lines of the cost and time involved in reaccreditation than anything being wrong with their standards. Do our standards currently meet the accreditation standards of CALIA as far as our policies are involved?
That's kind of hard to say. And just to clarify, we are accredited through WASPIC. We've gone through 2 reaccreditations, I think, but we are accredited. It's just through WASPIC. For CALIA standards, I haven't looked at their standards in so long that I can't really say if our policies meet them or not. They may very well. I just don't know. They change their standards every so often, just like WASPIC does. So I would guess that we don't. They're just by virtue of all the policies that you would have to meet. I've got to think that they've changed something where we would be outside of the standard.
But would it be a fair statement that you don't know of any major deviations from their standards that currently exist in the Lakewood department?
That's fair.
Here's a difficult balance. So one of the complaints from communities of color, usually in areas that are more geographically segregated than Lakewood is that for training purposes, people go where the crimes go, and that extra patrol results in a disproportionate, whether it's car stop or arrest, it turns out to have a disparate. It's not that the policies or practices themselves are discriminatory, but that very fact that there's an emphasis placed on a geographic area creates a disparity, even unintentionally. The balance on that, on the other side, is people who live in those neighborhoods many times are asking for additional police presence. So how do you balance that?
That's a kind of a big one. Well, I think there's a bigger social question there that I don't necessarily have the answer to. And that's just, that I think it holds true with almost every police department, is that even our dispatched calls for service come from predominantly lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. And minorities, particularly African Americans, are oftentimes disproportionately represented in those neighborhoods. Again, that's not a police thing, that's a society thing, and I don't necessarily have an answer to that. And we could just, only go to the calls where we're dispatched, and those are the neighborhoods that we would end up in. And I can show you the calls for service data that support that. I don't necessarily have an answer, but that's the balance is just being mindful of that, I guess, when we are in those neighborhoods.
I'm sure I have more questions, but not for now. I want to thank you. Is there anyone else who has questions or comments? Ms. Moss.
Mr. Mayor. Chief, thank you so much. A lot of the questions that I had have been answered, but some of the conversations that I'm in, the conversation often comes up where the rules and guidelines and everything is in place. How do you enforce that they're carried out? How are they enforced to carry it out? Because one of the things that I'm hearing is that policemen are so well protected, they're not going to tell on the next person. And if there wasn't for the videos, some of the things that is happening would get away. So I don't understand how you could enforce, you trust your people. We do, the people we work with. But if there's a bad apple in the bucket and we don't report it for fear of what's going to come back to me, how is that handled?
Well, we rely, one, on the integrity of the people that work on the department, the oversight that we have with supervisors, and just the visibility of the job. I mean, we don't, we're out in public doing all of our work, almost all of our work out in public view. and we rely on our citizens to come forward and say something. You know, we do get citizens coming forward and you know, with questions or concerns about something that they saw or they experienced, and we try and address those. And everything we do is in the public eye, I guess. And that's, we can't be looking over the shoulder, even with body cams and everything else. You can't be over the shoulder of every officer all day long, you know, their entire shift. So you do have to rely on the integrity of the officer themselves, their fellow officers, the process with the supervisors, and then the community to come forward when they see something wrong.
And I appreciate that, and I understand that. But if one of the fellow officers, and I'm just talking in general, not about specifically Lakewood, but if one of the officers see something that shouldn't be happening and choose not to report it, then he's just as guilty as the next person. But who's going to break that cycle?
Well, that's where the discipline comes from. When we see that happen, there is a specific section in the policy that says if you see wrongdoing, you need to go tell a supervisor at your next, you know, as soon as you can. So we do require that, and it's about, you know, when that is brought to our attention, you know, holding that person accountable, everybody involved accountable.
Yeah.
And we do get officers that raise concerns about other officers, and we look into those.
I appreciate that. It's just a conversation that's happening to come to me, and I really didn't have a good answer for them, but you get the material that you provided for us is very helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Volkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation, Chief. Just a few questions. So let me start first with the vascular neck restraints, VNR. I think I'm one of those people that don't really understand, and I'm not going to ask you to do a difference between a VNR and a chokehold. The governor has made it clear that this is something that he's gonna set up a task force, or perhaps he already has. So I'm wondering if he's calling chokeholds and he really means the VNRs or anything like that. Do you sense that there might be some confusion at that level, that they're actually going to be talking about VNRs at the state level?
Well, and that's what when I mentioned earlier, that ambiguity is worse than just outright banning something. I don't know if there's confusion or how much input they're getting from people as to what the difference is. I would prefer, I think it's a good tool, and I would prefer we keep it. But if there is a desire to ban it, I would prefer they use language that's clear, so that there isn't ambiguity that gets officers into trouble later.
Okay. And so then, thank you for responding a week or so ago about the use of no-knock warrants. And I was actually happy to hear. So could you explain it then for the rest of us, or for all of us and folks listening? Because there was really a tragic case in Kentucky about the use of a no-knock warrant and some confusion. And I was wondering how they're used, but could you explain how they're used in this state?
Sure. So no-knock warrants are exactly what it sounds like. You don't knock before you make entry. These are the most dangerous situations. You're only used in the most dangerous of circumstances. You actually have to get a judge to sign off on being able to do it. And I can give you an example of when we've used it once, and that was several years ago. And it's when a parent took his son by force. His young son had a gun and threatened to hurt the child if the police were called. That right there, if you knock and let the person know that it's the police, then you risk him harming that child. In a case like that, you have to get to that child as quickly as possible without letting the suspect know. But that's how dangerous it has to be in order for a judge to sign off on it. And again, it is they are not used frequently. And you do need the specific permission of a judge to get one.
Okay, so the judge has to, a Superior Court judge has to say, and you have to indicate when you're doing the warrant that it is going to be a no knock, or that's your request, and he or she has to approve it.
That's correct.
Okay. And in the last 10 years, well, you haven't been chief 10 years, so it's not fair to ask you, but since you've been chief, how many times have you used no knock warrants?
I don't think any since I've been chief. I think the incident I just described was before that.
Okay. So, and then I want to ask, it seems as though, and this is just not locally, but it happens a lot in the state of Washington. I'm not just saying, when I say locally, I mean the state of Washington, but it seems to happen more and more nationally. Officers dealing with people who are profoundly mentally ill. And it just doesn't seem to me like the normal rules apply, right? Because they're people who are just not going to respond to instructions. They just can't. But for whatever reason, states have thrown these people out on the streets. So, and that's policy in the state of Washington to have mentally ill people and not give them decent care. So we have these interactions, general public does, and then police officers are called in. The police officers, it seems to me, are using the same techniques that they would on a guy like me or somebody else, and then it just escalates completely out of control. These people can't take instructions because they're mentally ill, and somebody gets hurt or dies. And there's been local cases. I think even in Pierce County, probably about half the deaths that occur are with police officers are people who are profoundly mentally ill. So is there any different training that you give to help officers deal with that, or what are the instructions to officers, or what training do officers get to try to help them through circumstances like that? And what else could we do? Because I noticed that people are talking about it nationally, and I'm glad they're having this conversation. But when these confrontations occur, and they will, because we're going to have a discussion tonight that we're not going to put people, civilly commit people into Western State anymore. What are your officers trained to do, or what kind of training would be helpful?
Well, there's certainly more training that they're getting at the academy just from the start. And quite frankly, in Lakewood, if an officer goes an entire shift without dealing with somebody that is in some sort of mental crisis, it's a rare day. So in addition to training, there's a significant amount of experience from working in our area, dealing with people in crisis. To a certain extent, there is nothing more an officer can do. If you look at a situation where they're physically being attacked, an officer being attacked, if somebody's trying to kill you, it doesn't make a difference whether that person's motivated by anger, by drugs, by mental illness. You need to try and protect yourself. So to that extreme degree, there's not much more that they could do, because the split-second decision has to be to protect themselves or somebody else. We are, as a profession, had mental illness thrust upon us as a responsibility several years ago. None of us raised our hand and asked for it. So admittedly, we were not good at it when we first happened. There were, I'm sure, a lot of confrontations locally and nationally that didn't need to occur because there was an inexperience in dealing with these folks and recognizing that it was a mental illness versus somebody that was just acting out of anger or some other criminal motivation. We've since gotten much better. A lot of agencies have done something similar to what we've done, and embedding a mental health professional and having that component as part of our response, just emphasizing some of that lets people know that there's this consideration you have to make. Looking at a bigger picture, I will use the Daniel Covarrubias shooting in 2015 as an example. There was 1,000 social safety nets that absolutely failed that family before it got to us. And all those safety nets need to be addressed if you truly want to reduce the impact or the frequency of interactions between police and people with mental illness or some other serious drug addiction or any illness that's impairing their behavior or creating these crises. That absolutely has to be fixed, because the way it is now, whether it's the state or somebody else, they are leaving this to us. We are I think I heard I'm not going to quote it right, but a former assistant chief from Seattle that call us the social worker of last resort, but that's where we've become the first resort. And that needs to be fixed. Beyond, you can give us all the training you want. There's circumstances where we shouldn't be the default response for somebody with a mental illness, but that's where we're at.
Okay, I'll leave it at that, because I think there's a lot to be done in that world. I mean, we do have our person embedded. There's clearly needs to be more resources in that area. I know we have the mock T for multi-care that gets called out, and I think they come into Lakewood, and MCERT comes out from Central Pierce. And unfortunately, with the budget situation, until that works itself out, trying to bring more resources in might take a little while, but okay. Thank you. That's all I got, Mayor.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Chief, for your report tonight. Following up on this issue of mental health, I agree that the police were handed something that in many cases they weren't trained to handle in the first place. And I understand from some of the works that I've read that police departments, as you indicated, are catching up with this. And that brings me to a subject that we've also heard a lot about in the press, and that is the defunding. I think of it as reallocation of funds within police departments. Hypothetically speaking, do we have room to reallocate money for the needed training for our police officers when they confront somebody with mental health issues?
We do. I don't know. I mean, I would want it to be an efficient use of money and resources, and I don't know that there's a big gap there to fill. I mean, honestly, we deal day in and day out with a lot of people with serious mental illness, and we do it successfully. People want to give us training because there's this perception that we're doing it poorly, but I do think there's always room to get better. But I would also want the training, however we reallocate it, I would want it to be meaningful and not just something on paper.
Understood. Thank you.
And if I could address the comment about defunding police departments, I know that you touched on what I think it means, and that's reallocating resources. But the one thing that has to change as well is the people calling 911 because they're scared of the boogeyman. I mean, I don't know if I've told you all this before, but we've done a great job over the last 40 years since the inception of the 911 system of training people to call 911 whenever there's an emergency. And at the same time, through social media and mainstream media and movies and TV, we've trained people to see the boogeyman behind every corner, which results in a lot of people calling 911 just because they're nervous or scared, or they don't know who else to call. So if we reallocate those resources to a better suited system, that portion of it's going to have to be addressed as well, where we either tell people we are not coming if you call 911 for this, or we do, and, you know, and eventually over years they get trained that that's not the right resource, or all we've done is move money away, but not taken away any of the responsibility or duties.
Thank you.
Mr. Whalen.
I had to find the unmute button. Chief, I just want to wrap up my questions with a thank you. You know, you pass along wonderful comments from the public, and I think that the sentiment for the majority is that we do really good work out there. The community policing that you're doing is recognized and appreciated. But we've heard a lot of national stuff, and I'm looking at a Economic Development Board agenda meeting for the Board of Directors tomorrow about the EDB's role in ending racism, and it's a topic du jour. So my question is, with regard to allegations we've all heard about institutional racism, not necessarily directed at LPD or Lakewood per se, but generally, you know, what do you think from your years of experience out there, what you're hearing on the street, what can we do better as an organization to instill more public confidence in that regard? Is it a hiring thing that we need to look at for hiring policies? I know we've made great effort to try to hire diverse candidates. You know, what more can we help the organization do?
Well, thanks for the question. I know it's a lot of the conversation recently has been about use of force, and as I've said repeatedly over the years, that is a small fraction of what we do, what we actually do. And when we do use force, it's important that we're transparent about it. And I think as important as you know, not using force disproportionately is showing that we're not. And being more transparent about what our policies are, what our practices are, when there is an allegation of bias, not just investigating it, but going back and showing, here's what we did to investigate it. Here's the conclusions we came to, or help us come to this. I think it's more about transparency and showing that what we're not doing as much as it is what we are doing. And that some of that falls on us. You know, and I don't think, sorry to say, I don't think that's going to be resolved probably in my lifetime. I think it's going to be a lot of work over a lot of years. You know, it didn't just start yesterday. We're talking about hundreds of years of problems that, you know, might be bubbling up right now, but they've been around for a long time, and it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of years to get over that. But one thing that we can do is just be transparent about what we do. Now, the other thing that I am craving is for some lawmaker to stand up and say, we are as much a part of the problem as the police. There is no shortage of state and federal lawmakers that are standing up, pointing the finger at police and saying the system's broken. Well, we're working in the same system as they are. And having somebody stand up and acknowledge that would be helpful, because right now, all the finger pointing isn't helpful. It's just, you know, drawing or creating a bigger divide. So as you talk to your friends at the state and national level, that's one message that could be passed on.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Any other questions for the chief? Well, I'd like to thank you very much, not only for a presentation for tonight, but for doing a very difficult job that's become much more difficult. And I'm trusting that you will persevere and that we can make progress. So
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, especially on such short notice, and bringing such a concise and cogent presentation.
Thank you.
Now move to the Western State Hospital Master's Facility Plan update. For this, we have Mr. Buer and Ms. Brunel. Just as a minor aside, on the last presentation, my son-in-law, who's a firefighter, got called out this weekend for an injured crow. So there is a real problem with abuse at 911.
Good
Mr. Mayor?
We went at the same time. Good evening, Mayor,
Good.
Deputy Mayor, members of the council. I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen. I have a little bit of a visual aid. Okay. Are you seeing black in the back or just the picture of the map?
We have a map with a blue border on the left and right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So we are here tonight to provide an update on the Western State Hospital Master Facilities Plan update and SEPA environmental checklist review. Both of these applications were deemed complete on May 26th and are currently undergoing their first public notice period. I'm going to provide a summary of the project, discuss public outreach, and the next steps for this proposal. To summarize some significant changes in the master plan update, DSHS is proposing 3 expansions to the Western State Hospital capacity and the demolition of 16 buildings. The majority of the buildings that have been identified to be demolished are administrative, but they also include the commissary and 2 patient wards, buildings 21 and 27, which combined currently have 212 patients. In place of the several demolished buildings, DSHS has proposed 3 expansions. The general location of those expansions are identified on the screen. The first is a new 350-bed forensic hospital. The second is an 18-bed residential cottage in the Child Study Treatment Center. And the third is a new 48-bed community residential treatment facility. Combined, the construction of these new facilities will create 416 new patient units. I also wanted to note that under the current master plan, there are 3 expansions to the campus that are currently in process. Those are highlighted on this map by an asterisk. The first is an additional cottage at the Child Study Treatment Center. The second is an addition to building 28, and the third is a renovation of building 29. Together, these allow for 116 new patients. So the combined total of the additions currently under review and development and under the revised master plan is just under 730,000 square feet of new construction in the capacity for 532 additional patients. Additionally, long-term, the state has identified a goal to transition the hospital to serve primarily forensic patients or those who have been processed through the criminal justice system, and fewer civil commitment patients, which make up the majority of the 850 patients on site today. The city of Lakewood's been identified as the lead agency for the environmental review, and we launched a robust public comment period and participation plan on June 10th. Due to the project's size and scope, we opted to hold a 30-day comment period, which is the maximum allowed under the city's municipal code and state statute. In addition, we created a website to make commenting and accessing documents easy for the public and outside agencies. For the first time, people can submit comments directly through the website or email staff and send comments via standard mail. Today, an article was also published in the News Tribune, which included information on the proposal, the comment period, and directions on how to submit public comments. Currently, members of our development services team from Community Development and Public Works are reviewing the submitted documents in great detail, and we expect to issue a correction letter at the conclusion of the comment period. Some areas of concern in our initial comments include the proposed increase in square footage and overall parking count compared to an anticipated reduction that they highlight in vehicle trips. We are also seeking clarification on the number of existing and future patient beds, which is not clearly defined. Next, we want information regarding the future of the existing forensic hospital, buildings 28 and 29. We also want to hear more about the proposed decrease in staffing. And lastly, infrastructure deficiencies, including the electrical, water, natural gas system, and the sewer hookups. So in addition to our comments, all public agency comments will be forwarded to DSHS for their review and response. Once the correction letter is issued at the end of July or August, the city will wait to receive a response from DSHS prior to moving forward with issuing the threshold determination. Looking at page 2 of the memo included in the council packet, you can see that our next action is that correction letter. after the correction letter is sent. We have no firm dates because they're all dependent on when we receive documents back from DSHS. As of this afternoon, we have received 11 public comments via email or the website and 35 comments via social media. We have not received any agency comments yet, but we will send a reminder email on June 29th, July 6th, and July 9th to remind agencies of the comment deadline. That was a brief project summary, discussion of public outreach, and next steps. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Ms. Brunel?
Mayor.
Mr. Volkey.
Thank you. Courtney, thank you for the presentation, but let me try to understand. And I guess these are some of the questions that you have, but let's try to help me with a baseline. You're saying there's currently 850 patients or 850 beds out there, and that would include both civil and forensic, because there are forensic folks out there.
Correct. Right now, according to the executive summary, there's approximately 360 forensic services beds and 500 civil commitment beds.
So their goal is then they're not closing the forensic facilities that they have. So the new building, does that add how many additional folks? Or are they closing beds anywhere?
350 beds are in addition for the new forensic hospital. They are proposing to demolish 2 buildings that currently have patient wards, and the combined total of those units is 212. So that's one point, as you pointed out, that we are seeking clarification on. So right now, for their baseline, they're saying that they have the capacity for 907 patients, and that's between the Child Study Treatment Center and Western State Hospital.
Presently?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And then they're looking to have 817 once the new forensic hospital is built, but there is no clear explanation as to where the 300 to 500 patients in the middle are going.
Okay, okay, so this is what I'm following. There's 360 forensic beds now. They want to build 350. When I walk through the campus, one of the forensic facilities is fairly new. They're not going to, and that's not one of them that's on the list to get torn down. So I'm thinking, well, they're keeping that. And so they're building in the new large building that they want to build. That's completely forensic, correct? Okay. And then I'm trying to find my way here through, bear with me. So
Mr. Volkey, Mr. Bureau has a comment. I think he has some clarification for you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Volkey, if you look at table 1, we have some issues with the numbers.
What page is that on, Mr.
That's
Bureau?
going to be on page 3, III. It's at the very beginning of the Western State Hospital Master Plan document. It would be 1, 2, 3, 4, about the 5th page under the executive summary.
So past the governor's picture.
Before the governor's picture.
Before the governor's picture, okay.
It's on the right-hand side. It says table 1, existing and projected bed counts. There's some problems with the table.
Okay, thank you. Okay, go ahead, keep going.
One of the things is if you look at the long-term use for the forensic services, it says 21, 27, 28, and 29, and it has to be determined. The to be determined, the city of Lakewood is requesting clarification.
Okay.
I'd also point out that that same to be determined is found in civil commitment buildings, but it also lists buildings that are to be that are going to stay in, but actually, if you go further in the document, are to be demolished. So for example, buildings 21 and 27 are to be demolished at some future date, yet they include it in the bed type. So that's another problem. If you do the math and go through this, you'll find out that some of the columns don't add up properly and that we're missing a couple of units here and there. So this is one of the primary issues we have with this document. Now, then if you go to later in the document, on page 37, it then discusses what happens to building 28 and 29. And there, they're proposing to place those facilities to house patients found not guilty by reason of insanity. And those are referred to as NGRI patients. So they're breaking up the forensic wards basically into two buildings. But the existing facility in 28 and 29 is fairly large, and I find it difficult to believe that the entire facility will be used for this population. So those are some of the things that we are trying to figure out and get a better understanding of what is being proposed. Another comment that I would make about master planning processes in the city of Lakewood, we do this on a regular basis for Pierce College, Clover Park Technical College, the hospital, Sound Transit, and the school district. And to be very frank about it, the process is pretty simple because you come in and say specifically, this is the building that I'm going to build. This is what it's going to be used for. These are the number of classroom spaces. This is the size. Here's the parking. And we have a very clear understanding of what the proposal is. And the master plan is easy to take to the hearing examiner. He reviews it, and usually they are approved with very little or no heartache. Here, it's different because we're dealing with a master plan that's a blob map. It lacks specifics. And that's what's kind of driving us crazy. We would like to see more information on what the master plan is going to look like. So that's going to be some of the comments that we're going to discuss. The other issue is the residential treatment facility. That's currently a concept, but it's the method by which you could place civil commitments back into Western State Hospital at a future date. We've had some conversation internally whether or not that should be approved as a part of the master plan, or that should be considered as a update or a phased development at some future date. So again, these are some of the questions that we have about this project. I will tell you that going through the master plan document, we have many, many questions.
Okay, and thank you for the explanation. So let me, and then I'm going to ask you about the residential treatment facility. So what we have basically is that they said they're going to build these new buildings. They want to tear down some. There's currently X number of people out there. They're switching, they're saying they're going to lower the number of civil commitments and increase the number of forensic patients. But in reality, it sounds like they've given themselves leeway on that chart that you said, table 1, that says medium term, short term, long term, medium term. But really, the legislature could say in the middle of construction, oh, we would really like to keep more civil beds out there because we haven't been able to find other locations in the state where people want to build these hospitals. Is that something that could occur?
Yes. And one of the other things that we're watching too is the governor's budget. I mean, we're having issues. I'm sure they are. Will these facilities be built in the future? Will DSHS make all of these improvements to this facility, or will it be phased over time? There's just a lot of questions. On the residential treatment facility, I believe that the state is looking at 28 locations throughout the state. City staff is currently monitoring the status of those and are they moving forward? The other question
are they
is,
mental? Okay, go ahead.
They're residential treatment facilities. I can get you a better definition, Mr. Boki, but my understanding is it could allow for civil commitments, and that is based upon some of the comments in the master plan document.
And what else were you going to say? Or
We're
Good.
monitoring their locations. We want to make sure that, there's a level playing field here. That one of the issues has been that Pierce County has been the so-called dumping ground. And, we want to follow through and make sure that this works the way it's supposed to.
Okay.
I would also say we want greater specificity. We would like to see probably a different layout. If we're going to do 10 years, I think what we have now might be too broad, and the city would like to have more information.
Are they telling us there's going to be less employees or more?
Courtney, you want to answer that?
Yeah, fewer overall. And especially if you look at the traffic impact analysis that they conducted, they're saying that they're going to be increasing square footage, increasing parking, but they're expecting an overall traffic decrease due to staffing reductions.
Is the school district involved in the discussions about the increase in the size of the Child Study and Treatment Center? Because they educate those kids.
We have reached out to Steilacoom School District as well as Clover Park School District. I have not received comments directly back from either agency yet, but they've both been contacted. I do know that Western State Hospital also said that they did some initial outreach. I don't know how productive that was because it was back February, March, and we didn't receive an update from them regarding that outreach.
Thank you.
I know Ms. Brunel, probably first. In this evaluation, is there any discussion of alternative sites? If you look at their estimation of values and costs, the land value in relation to the rest of the project is relatively minimal.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly don't think that the first choice for a facility of this type would be sandwiched between a park, a high school, and a residential neighborhood like Western State is, having had these things grow up around it. So how is that addressed?
In planning conversations with them, we've really made an effort to emphasize this point. We've pointed them towards the countywide planning policies. We also gave them supplemental documents on siting for mental health facilities. And the reaction has been, this has been set aside for a state hospital. Our resources are here. And so this is the best location for it. But that is another point that we do expect to ask additional information on as part of the correction letter. The one place where they do that siting criteria is in the RTF, the residential treatment facility, where they do evaluate different proposals. But for the new forensic hospital, they really rely on the fact that Western State Hospital is already located here and that there's an RCW that exists that says that this land shall house, I can't remember if it's a hospital or a facility for mental illness. And so they've relied on that to build this new facility.
I just know, I think that was in the original deed from the federal government that it was, Fort Steilacoom was ceded to the state, provided that they had at that time, I think they termed it an insane asylum on the site, but they've obviously waived that over the year. They have a college, they have a golf course, they have a park. So the feds don't seem interested in objecting to change of use.
Yeah, and in our conversations with them, our point has been, it is currently. And so why does this necessarily need to be the location of a new hospital as well as the existing facilities? And we haven't received a siting comparison. There has been conversations that we've been made privy to of them looking at other locations, but ultimately this is where they applied for the master plan.
Right. Ms. Farmer.
Several of my questions have already been answered, but I'm curious, what are the parameters of a SEPA lead agency? So what can we actually affect for this process?
Sure. So realistically, there's probably two options for a SEPA moving forward. The first would be an MD&S, meaning that there are probable adverse impacts, environmental impacts, but they can all be mitigated. And the second would be a determination of significance, or a DS, which would launch an environmental impact statement. And really the course of an environmental impact statement, we do scoping. Well, we would hire a consultant. They would perform scoping, drafting of an EIS, and then the final environmental impact statement, which would address the elements that cannot be mitigated and or mitigation options. And one of the requirements under an EIS is what the mayor had alluded to, which is the alternatives, alternative siting for the hospital, for example, or alternative locations on this site. That would all be something that would be required through an EIS.
Okay, citing requirements, environmental issues, placement of buildings, sewer, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
versus actual operations or how many beds, how closely is SEPA related to operations of the facility?
I don't think that it's so much related to operations, but there is a provision in SEPA regarding the community character and preserving community character. And so I do think that that is one avenue that may be explored through this process, is community compatibility and preserving community character. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Mr. Bjork.
Well, this is an important comment to make. Western State Hospital did have lead agency status. They could have done the threshold determination for their project, but instead they actually gave lead agency status to the city of Lakewood. That is unique, and I think it's worth pointing out.
Okay. I don't know, I don't have the exact numbers, but I believe that there's a subsidization or a funding pattern for the state for our police services, because there's a lot of activity that goes on there. Has there been any consideration to this new relationship, this new facility campus would affect our police services, or any talk about that?
We are waiting for agency comments. The Lakewood Police Department was one of the agencies, interagencies, Public Works as well, where we are all together as a city, but that department has yet to provide us with comments, but they were included in our agency reach out list.
Okay. I'm very, very glad we're having this conversation. I think we're at a unique, there's a unique time for us to be able to redefine our relationship with the state. It's been a rocky road over the years, and preserving that community character, I think, is very important. So I'll be getting the word out to folks to get their comments in. Thank you.
Mr. Volkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple of one comment and one question. So let me say what I do like, at least at first blush, is I do appreciate the preservation of open space. I think it creates a good buffer between the neighborhood in the back and or to the north, and the busy hospital setting that we have there, because it is a busy setting. So I do appreciate the preservation of the open space, and I actually look forward to, in future years, the city discussing how we can use that open space. They already use it for disc golf, but so I do appreciate that point. My question has to do with parking. When I walk through there, you've got employees. It seems as though it's a facility as it sits today that has a lot more employees than it does parking spots, or has a lot more parking spots, but they're so far away from the buildings that are actually in use that the employees are kind of parking on the side of the road and various things like that. There's a lot towards the north that doesn't look like it's been improved since the 60s. It's just big potholes, and it's not really a lot. It's just gravel. So I don't know if it's too many employees for too few spots, or my guess is that it's too many employees for too few spots that are close to where they work. And when they're done at 10 o'clock at night, they don't want to walk a quarter mile to the. Number one, is it a problem? Number two, are they addressing it adequately in this plan?
I do
Thank
think
you.
anyone that's visited the campus acknowledges the problem that there is there with parking. They are proposing a 20% increase in parking from what's located on site today.
Okay. And it will be next to the buildings that they serve, or?
It's scattered throughout the site, so
Okay.
yes and no.
Okay, thanks.
Something,
Mayor? There's one comment that I'd like to make that we haven't discussed yet, but it's important. I do think there's a relationship between Western State Hospital and adult family homes. And that's something that we plan to explore as a part of this process to determine just exactly how many patients, if any, end up in adult family homes and where in Lakewood. And that's going to be one of our questions. But also, as they close these facilities, these civil commitment facilities, and they do not have residential treatment facilities, where are these civil commitment patients going to go? And we do not have answers to this. I don't think DSHS has answers yet, but this is a question I think that is reasonable to ask. And given the preponderance of the number of adult family homes in Lakewood, which is over 100 now, I think it's reasonable for the city to request additional information on this. So you're going to see that move forward as a part of the master plan.
I'd like to thank you for that comment, Mr. Brewer. In fact, I was, as you were interviewed for the News Tribune story, and one of the concerns that I expressed was the lack of adequate treatment for people who were released from the civil side of Western State Hospital, and particularly the fact that I haven't seen a risk from the newer security risk from the newer forensic side of the facility, and that's what he was asking about. The security risk is the felony flips who get into a stream that doesn't appear to have adequate resources to house and treat them, and they, like you indicated, can end up in adult family homes, which is, in my view, no good for anyone, the patient, the community. But I appreciate the fact that you're on that. Any other questions, Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I want to come back to the last comment that Dave Brewer made. I appreciated that statement, Dave. And I just want to play the devil's advocate with you here for a minute. You and I and everybody here tonight know that we've got a lot of adult family homes, over 100 in the city of Lakewood. We know we can have a discussion with Western State Hospital and the Department of Human Health Services. To what end?
One of the things that
are we really going to get any kind of resolution from two agencies that have consistently blocked us on the issue of adult family homes in Lakewood?
Let's see where this takes us, but because we are allowed to propose mitigation as a part of an EIS and or as a part of the master plan process, one of the thoughts that occurred to me is, can the city of Lakewood place a cap on the number of adult family homes in the city of Lakewood based upon the fact that we have Western State Hospital in our backyard? So that's something.
So go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's something that we're going to explore. And I'm not sure exactly how DSHS is going to handle it, but that's one option that we are thinking about at this time.
All right, let me ask you another question. Again, hypothetical, playing the devil's advocate. You say we can ask that they place a cap. Could we ask that they reduce the number of adult family homes in Lakewood for equal distribution around the county, which I believe is the way the state first created this system?
I think that's more challenging to do. We can have the conversation. I don't know where it's going to end, but adult family homes is an issue in Lakewood. The fact is that we have 1/3 of all adult family homes in Pierce County. And I think it's reasonable to conjecture that Western State Hospital has something to do with it, along with certain other economic factors. But I think we can have the conversation and see where it takes us. After all, they want something from us, which is a permit. And then we would like to address housing quality, or excuse me, the quality of life in the city of Lakewood. And I think there's maybe some common ground that we can find that we currently do not have.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that.
Any other questions for Mr. Buer or Ms. Brunel? Well, thank you for your fine work and thank you for your presentation tonight. And we'll move on to the next item of business. More good news. Review of first quarter financial report with Ms. Krause.
So I'd like to share my screen, Brianna. Can you see my screen?
Not see your screen, but you should have the ability to do that by clicking on the green share screen.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is the first quarter financial report. One thing I want to highlight on the first page is I did add a new section for 1406 Affordable Housing Program, although there really isn't anything to report at this time. On the first page or the second page of the report is a chart that shows the operating revenues and operating expenditures. As you can see in the 2020 budget, our operating revenues and operating expenditures pretty much align. But in the prior years, you'll see that operating revenues are quite a bit higher than operating expenditures. And that really has to do with conservative budgeting and just staying within our expenditure budget and actually having savings at the end of the year. On the next page is our cash balance. You'll see that our ending fund balance has grown. However, our cash balance is a little bit lower. And that's because we're looking at prior years, the ending balance at the end of the year. In 2020, we are just at the first quarter. So overall, I went back and I took a look at where we were in cash over the last few years. And actually this year, we're actually higher in cash than we have been in the past few years. This is our general and street fund revenues and expenditures. And you'll see that on the far right corner here, our operating revenues are below our year-to-date budget by $633,000 or 6%. But at the same time, our expenditures have savings of about $737,000 or 7%. So at the end of the first quarter, we end up with $10,164,000 in ending fund balance. Our 12% operating reserves are met, and we have an undesignated balance that we're saving for 2020, 21, and 22 of $5.2 million. Property tax revenues have come in at $526,000 or 16% below what we had anticipated. And that really is due to the tax deferrals that the county has granted. And so we should be seeing those payments come in after June. And I just took a look at what we've seen for April year to date. And April property tax revenues are actually $44,000 above what we had budgeted. So that brings our year to date down to about $483,000 or 13%, 12%. So by next month, I'm expecting that gap to close some. Sales and use tax, really all the data that we have is just for the first 3 months. So this only includes about 2 weeks of the pandemic impact. And compared to 2020 year-to-date budget, we're actually up by 1.4%. But compared to where we were for the same period in 2019, we're down by $257,000. So looking at the sales tax by sector, we can see that we're down in the retail trade by about $201,000. $181,000 of it is in the motor vehicle and parts dealers. And of this amount, $100,000 is due to 2019 having some one-time sales of buses, which we didn't experience this year. Our services are down by $116,000, with food and service drinking places down by $83,000. And repairs and maintenance, that's primarily repairs of vehicles, is down by $23,000. Construction continued to increase at $26,000. And then from there, we have less minor increases. There is an item that we're following up with this date on, and that is our first quarter 2020 sales tax mitigation. And in 2018 and 19, we averaged about $30,000. So we're trying to find out what happened to that money since we did not see it come in. Then I'm skipping over to our utility tax. Utility tax seems to be coming in on target. And I'm expecting the same for the April, though we don't have all of our payments in yet. Gambling tax is where we're seeing a hit. And in previous years, we've received about $3.1, $3.2 million. Our estimate is conservative at $2.8 million. But compared to where we were in 2020, we're down by $248,000. And compared to the year-to-date budget, we're down by $131,000. And most of our gambling tax is from the card rooms. And so you're seeing a big decrease in all of those card rooms. Admissions tax is another area that has been hit by the pandemic. And you can see that in the year-to-date 2020, we had seen some decreases, but not nearly as much as we did in March. And you can see that our movie theaters are the two biggest generators of admissions taxes down. Franchise fees, those do not seem to be impacted yet. And we're on target and actually over what we had anticipated compared to 2019, as well as the year-to-date budget. State shared revenues, you'd heard before that we were expecting maybe a 20% decrease in the motor vehicle fuel tax. What we're seeing is about a 12% decrease as of the first quarter. Police photo infractions are coming in higher than we had seen in the previous years. In 2020, net revenues total about $160,000 compared to $114,000 of 2019. So we're doing good in that area, collecting the fees. And just something to highlight here, you can see that school zones in 2020 is up. We're going to expect that to drop with the closure of schools. Jail services, the one thing I want to highlight here is we are missing one payment for Pierce County. I'm expecting it to be somewhere in the $24,000 range. We just didn't have it at the time for this report. Dispatch services, we're on target, and I did hear from the chief that the expenditure estimate is the same for 2021. We're still doing receiving grants and spending grants. Animal licenses, there is a decrease of $7,000. Some of it is timing of when payments were received. We didn't have it at the time of preparing this report, but we have reached out to Pet Data and we're following up with them. And it appears that there has been a discrepancy in the timing of the payments. Alarm permits and fees. This is one that's been outstanding for quite some time. And as of today, I'm still waiting for an answer as to whether the major companies have paid their alarm permits. Municipal court revenues for the first quarter is not looking all too bad. There has been some decrease in revenues for March. And I took a look at where we are today for the first 6 months, and it looks like we're going to be down about 15% for the first 6 months. So it appears that people aren't able to pay their fees or fines. For community and economic development, we're seeing that business license is down, and there's a number of reasons for why the business licenses are down. So due to the pandemic, there's been a closure of the state business licensing office. So there's been some delays in processing. The state also deferred the general business license expiration dates, so we have less renewal revenue. Then we changed regulations in 2018, which essentially eliminated the temporary business license. And with Deja Vu closure in September of 2019, our specialty licenses are down. Development services and permits for the first quarter, not too bad. We're over what we did in 2019 by 136,000 or 50%. But compared to the year-to-date budget, we're down by $6,000 or 1%. And just by taking a look at where we are today, we're still over what we did in 2019. And these are just preliminary numbers by about $183,000 or 29%. But compared to the budget, we're down by 36,000 or 4%. But we are expecting some new permits. The only thing is the timing of when those permits will be realized. I'll skip down to the cost recovery for development services. So the target is at 85%, and this fluctuates, over the years. But just taking a look when the average recovery ratio since the policy of 85% was adopted by the council, the recovery ratio was about 90% between 2016 and 2019. For the first quarter, we're at 82%, so slightly below the target. Property abatement funds, the good news here on property abatement and the rental housing safety program is there's money to address some issues. So the ending fund balance for property abatement is $584,000 at the end of the first quarter. And in the rental housing safety program, the year-to-date ending fund balance is $86,000. This is the new section that I just set up for the affordable housing program. So we notified DOR of the City Council's ordinance, passing that. The tax becomes effective on May 1st, 2020, and the city will receive its first distribution in July 2020. Though there may be some early reporting, so we may see some things coming in May and June. So I set up the accounts and we'll just track it from there. I've set up the revenue budget based on trends of where we were on sales tax, and so we'll see where we land. I'm not going to cover the different areas of the CDBG. A lot of this is accounting for transparency. But at the end of the first quarter, we do have assets of $1.4 million. And we've got about $1.4 million in restricted funds, meaning that they have to be used for CDBGs for new loans or such. We have two more grants that fall under CED, and that's a neighborhood stabilization program that has almost $200,000. And we have our SSMCP balance of about $235,000. Parks and Recreation sales tax is just on target, just less than 1% off the year-to-date budget and just slightly under 2020 activity. The cost recovery for parks is 45%, and right now we're about 43% recovery. And I know that number will change with the canceled events. Human Services Program, not too much change there, $360,000, and we'll start keeping track of where we are on the expenditures. And that, I'll skip over to real estate excise tax. So for real estate excise tax, I think we're doing pretty well here. In the past, we've collected about 2.4 million in 2017, and in 2018-19, we've done really well. For the first quarter, because of conservative budgeting, we're in the good by 183,000 or 50%. I took a look at where we were through May of this year, and compared to budget, we're up by about $210,000. And compared to 2019 actual, because we had some major sales, we're down by $326,000. And just some major transactions. This is a new section. It's not a new section, but it's an update on the Transportation Benefit District. You don't see the tables here because we've set those monies aside in a liability account awaiting the state's direction on what we need to do with this money. So as of the first quarter, we have $203,000 in the TBD liability account. We are looking to update the ordinance on completed projects, and if there is any new projects that would be eligible in some type of form for a benefit district. Because if you remember that the TBD fee that goes away is the vehicle licensing fee. So there may be some other projects that are eligible for some type of TBD, which we'll update at a later time. Hotel, motel, lodging tax, we're above the year-to-date budget by 22,000 or 13%, but we're down from where we were last year by about 6%. And the rest of it is on the operating funds. And I think I've covered most of the areas that have significant revenue sources. And that concludes my presentation.
Questions for Ms. Kraus? So I have one. Screwed up my screen here. You mentioned a one-time bus purchase last year. Do you know if that was in the fourth quarter or when it was?
It would have been in the first quarter of 2019.
So, and I assume that when Pierce Transit purchases buses, the use tax is paid in as a Lakewood is the nexus for out-of-state purchase. Is that correct?
Okay, now I have to go back and rethink about this. It is where the, and I'm not going to say I'm 100% complete because I've had this question come up. It's just been a number of years. If you purchase a vehicle, it is where the, let me just step back. Okay, so when I was in Federal Way, we had a mall in the town center, in the Commons, and they had a tent set up and such where people could come buy vehicles. But the seller was actually in Auburn, so I believe Auburn received the sales tax. So it's really where they take, I guess, where they do the paperwork to sign that over.
Well, buses are purchased from out-of-state manufacturers.
Okay, so then that would make sense that we got the sales tax because we're getting.
Well, that's actually good news because at the end of last year, Pierce Transit's budget was modified to accept a grant, and there was authority in December to buy 22 CNG buses and 3 electric buses, which would probably be in excess of $10 million sale. So maybe that isn't going to, maybe it's going to equal out. It takes, there's a big lag time before the buses get there. So that would make sense. If
Well, based on our analysis, we should see that stand out pretty well.
Any other questions for Ms. Kraus?
Mr. Mayor?
I can't see anybody's hand raised. Yeah,
Oh.
wave at me. Oh, there it goes. I got my screen back. Mr. Volpe.
And Ms. Kraus, I'd like to ask about the LTAC, the hotel motel lodging tax. And I don't know what kind of capacity they're at. I mean, we can see the March numbers where we were 25% below budget and 39% below last year. And it just got worse from there, I guess. So, and it looks like that we have enough fund balance to cover a shortfall in this and still do all the expenditures that we approved. But is that true for next year? And help me out, and the mayor, I guess, is on that committee. Are we obligated for 2021 yet?
So I'm happy to answer that. So the way that the lodging tax works is we're allocating the prior year's revenues. So we have enough set aside for expenditures that, or awards that were allocated for 2020. So we'll do an estimate for where we are in 2020 to make the 2021 allocations.
Okay, so that the trouble is next year, but we haven't agreed to anything on the 2021 allocations except for we still have an obligation to the McGavick Center.
That's correct.
Okay, but beyond that, we don't have any. So, okay, so we'll base what we're budgeting for 2021 or what we tell the group that they're budgeting for is going to be based on what our revenue estimates are for this year.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I would note that while the individual hotels may have varied widely because of JBLM, Pierce County outside the base fared better than King County in April. I think there was 35% occupancy and the King County numbers were down like 15 or something. So there was some mitigation of that, but I haven't seen anything more recently. Mr. Whalen.
Just a thought. Thank you very much for the report. It's sobering as always, but I'm positive and hopeful things will get better. But if the feds don't come through with some finances for cities and towns, and if the quarter that you've just described for us continues in that direction, what's the burn rate of our cash flow?
Well, I'd like to switch over to the next topic that talks more about what we do in situations with the COVID-19. Okay. I am monitoring the cash and I've taken a look at where we are just for the first 6 months of the year. And now we're fine for the first 6 months and we still have healthy cash balance.
Great.
So,
and that is attributable to having, I will say again, and you've heard this many times, is good financial policies, conservative budgeting. We ended up 2019 in pretty good condition.
Right. And may I add, really smart staff. Thank you.
And I believe if we move to the next subject, Ms. Krause is going to tell us how that smart staffing intends to
exactly.
Dealing with continued conservative budgeting and how far do you want to burn into reserves? So we'll move now to COVID-19 financial update with Ms. Krause.
Okay, I have my, can you see my screen still?
Not yet.
Okay.
Go down to the bottom, hit green.
All right, you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so you've heard a lot of this information before. I think City Manager has shared it on many different occasions in many different ways. So I'm going to skip over the first few pages of this document, which you recently heard at the April 27th carry forward budget adjustment, as well as in various updates. So the presentation is really in 3 parts. The first part is the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the general fund for 2020, 2021, and 2022. Then we're going to talk about 2020 and how we bridge that gap if we're not to receive any relief from Congress. And then if we don't have any relief from Congress, what are we looking like in 2021 and 2022 and what measures we'll be looking at? And it will be a service level reduction and what that service level reduction will look like. So I'm going to skip over. We had promised to follow up with the City Council on 3 different scenarios. Those 3 different scenarios have been assigned a probability. Scenario 1 being that we have an economic downturn in 2020, and actually all scenarios have the economic downturn in 2020. It's a matter of when do we start recovery. In scenario 1, we have recovery starting in early 2021. In scenario 2, the recovery doesn't start until early 2022, and that's a 50% probability. And lastly, for scenario 3, which is the most pessimistic, and hopefully is not the one that will materialize, shows that the recovery will occur in early 2023. But I do want to preface this with, we only have very limited information. We've gotten first quarters of information. We don't have a complete month of sales tax with COVID-19 impact. We haven't received our gambling tax. We don't know what admissions tax looks like. We have, things that have come in that we actually receipt in our system, such as our development services. But a lot of the state distributions and state revenues we have not received. I will not have information until towards the end of the month for April in many of those cases. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the 2020 balancing strategy. So taking a look at where we are, making a guess, because we don't really have empirical data to support this. These are just really best guesses. Our total general fund revenue loss in 2020 is $5.7 million. There are some adjustments that I'm making to those revenue loss because it also includes the revenue loss to the street fund. So when fuel tax is down, which we're anticipating, the general fund will kick up some funds to make up that difference. But because we're expecting less revenues, our 12% of operating revenues for the general and street fund also decreases. So our ending fund balance deficit projected is about $5.2 million in 2020. So bridging that gap, the strategy that we have is, first of all, we'll always have some type of expenditure savings. And with the measures that the city manager has put in place in March of 2020, we're anticipating that those revenue or expenditure savings could amount out to $600,000. It could be more, it could be slightly less. And then we have excess fund balance, and this is the $3.1 million that we're expecting to have excess funds in 2020. And that again, good financial policies that council adopted and conservative revenue estimates. So of the almost $3.2 million, we're proposing $2,334,000 to help offset that ending fund balance deficit. Additionally, we have about $4 million in the fleet and equipment fund. And I will also say that's also included as part of city manager's directive on, non-essential spending. So we have about $4 million at the end of this year. That would be reduced by $2.3 million if everything were to come in the way that is presented here. And I'm just going to skip over to what you can expect next. As with, I think we share a lot of information with the city council in terms of finances. I know I share a lot of information with the city manager. We'll continue to do that. And, depending on when we hear back from Congress, if they will have any financial relief for the cities, we will begin later this year and sooner than later, as city manager always says, to look at 2021 and 2022 and determine what those reductions in the budgets will look like. We'll continue our quarterly financial reports. This is our budget year, so we're still scheduled to bring a balanced budget to the city council on October 5th. And then hopefully, we have meetings in between, and hopefully we'll have that adopted by November 18th. And we still have one more year-end budget adjustment. So we'll take a look, some of the things that are coming up on those year-end budget adjustments is the CARES monies. And, depending on whatever money else we get, those will require some budget adjustments. So for 2021, the way that I've done the budgeting is I've assumed if we have positions today, those positions will be filled with the exception of those positions that have been identified at the very beginning that they would be limited term, meaning they would expire at the end of the year 2020. So we had in 2020 216.25 positions. For the 2021 and 2022 forecast, the preliminary number is 212.75 positions. So we had a little bit of reductions. Here is the FTE. And, we're looking at 2008 because that was when the Great Recession. And you can see that we had almost 252 FTEs. Going into 2022, we're looking at 212 FTEs. And the bulk of it is in the general and street fund. That's the city's main operating funds. And then I've added a line here that shows the commissioned officers. So in 2008, we had 105 commissioned officers. In 2022, I'm projecting 99 commissioned officers consistent with the 2019 and 2020 budget. This is a little bit busy, but this just shows the number of positions by departments. So you can see that police has a good chunk. Then we have some administrative departments, public works and such. We do have a number of bargaining groups, and this is an update on those bargaining groups. We have 212 FTEs, just over 212 FTEs. 93 of them belong to the LPIG. We've got 4 in the Lakewood Management Police Guild, and Teamsters has 4. AFSCME is our second largest represented group, and then we have our non-reps at 29. So for AFSCME, I understand that they've reached some agreement, but that has not been included in the projections that I ran because this was ran some time before that decision. So at the time of this report, the negotiations were in process, and I only provided for step increases, doesn't include a COLA, and this is consistent to their current contract. Teamsters got a 2.5% COLA in 2021, and that's in accordance with their contract as well. The Lakewood Police Independent Guild, I projected for step increases for 21 and 22, no COLA yet. And then for the Police Management Guild, they received a 3% COLA in 2021 and a 3% COLA in 2022 in accordance with their current contract. Non-represented with the financial condition as projected does not include any COLA. I've also included a forecast, in the forecast, a 10% increase for medical, 3% for orthodontia, vision, and dental. These projections were completed well in advance of AWC announcing their preliminary and subject to change rates that are projected to increase 7 to 11% for medical and 0 to 3% for dental, and no increase for vision. And this one, I do have to wait. So even after AWC determines what that rate will be, it isn't just a flat 3% increase, you know, for each type of benefit that we have. So in the scenarios, I took a look at where we were if we were in a perfect world. And that perfect world, if you remember in the 2020 budget, we end up with excess fund balance of almost $3.2 million. In the perfect world, with revenues continuing to increase, I was expecting that we would actually have more, almost 3.67 million. And then taking conservative approaches on the revenue forecast in 21 and 22, we would still have a healthy ending fund balance reserve. But with the pandemic, that's all changed. And with scenario 1, 30%.
Ms. Kraus, your sound just went out. Hello?
Okay, can you hear me?
Now you came back.
Okay, so I'm not sure what happened. So I'm comparing the 2020 with the revised budget, and the revised budget, compared to the revised budget, we're looking at a 14% decrease in 2020, and that's in scenario 1. And then taking a look at 21 and 22, these are measured, you know, to the prior year. So 2021 would be compared to the 2020 year-end estimate, and 22 to the 21 estimate. Expenditures remain the same with the exception of the street O&M. So if revenues on the street O&M fund decrease, general fund expenditures increase. So in this scenario 1, you know, I mentioned that we're $5.2 million ending fund balance deficit. That grows to $8.8 million in 2021, and in 2020 or 2021, and then 2022, it is almost $10 million. And this is a lot of information, but if you were interested in what that change in revenues is, here's all of the different revenue sources and what the change is. And the presentation that I just went over for 2020 for the first scenario is consistent with scenarios 2 and 3. Scenario 2 is not as nice, as scenario 1. We show an operating income and loss of 5.7 million and then 5 million in 2021, because remember that recovery in this instance would be in early 2022. So you're seeing 2022 in a better position. And in scenario 2, we're looking at a ending fund balance deficit of 11.3 million in 2021 and almost 14 million in 22. And so I want to say that scenario 2 is the scenario that we're feeling is going to be the outcome. And then you'll see the same thing for scenario 3. And scenario 3 shows a 13.3 million ending fund balance deficit in 21 and almost a $19 million deficit in 2022. And this is just everything on one page, which might be a little bit busy. But there have been measures that we've taken, which the city manager has outlined. There has been some changes since then. And so we currently have 12.5 FTEs that are vacant. Some of these have remained vacant. Some of them have been filled with contracted services and a combination of in-house work. There's been a pause on all discretionary spending, non-mandatory training, supplies, certifications. There's been exceptions to the discretionary spending, but they have to be approved in advance. Internal service projects and replacements should be only those that are completed by the end of the year. And then, as I mentioned, real estate excise tax is still performing well at this point, and any excess funds are going to be set aside to offset any revenue loss in the REIT fund. Because remember, we still have debt service payments that we're obligated to make for transportation CIP. Okay. So I've covered this already, strategies to be considered as potential options, using financial reserves or contingencies to maintain services temporarily, where we're looking at elimination and reduction of operating programs and reduction or eliminating of capital improvement projects. As you know, that the city council has authorized in the forecast $700,000 from the general fund to the transportation improvement projects, as well as $80,000 to the park CIP. We are, waiting for Congress on the relief of the financial relief to backfill revenue loss. But if none of this were to come through, and we do see economic downturn because of the pandemic, we've already taken a look at what are those options for decreasing the budget with an associated service level reduction. So mandatory or legally mandated functions would continue to be performed, though they could be slightly impacted, but they would still be provided because they're legally mandated. But if we were to take a look, so the city manager's direction was, okay, what would it look like if we did a 20% operating budget cut by all departments? And that includes everybody. So the operating budget for 2020 totals about $44 million. And I've included those other funds that are internal service, but they are general fund supported for the most part. So you can see in the second column in red, those are the target reductions. We also have 193.15 FTEs in the general and street fund. The reduction would be 55.4 FTEs, which is about a third, almost a third of the FTEs if we needed to come up with $8.4 million to cover the deficit. So for some things, the city council, there's not much we can do on the salaries and benefits because that's not up to us. It's up to the Independent Salary Commission. So we're looking at supplies and, events. The youth council budget is in the city council, same with the sister cities. So those are the areas that we'd be taking a look at. For the city manager to come up with 147,000, that may be eliminating 1.0 FTE or the equivalent of 1.0 FTE. It'll eliminate some travel and training, some memberships, reducing the connections paper production to 8 pages. and eliminating some supplies, and possibly even eliminating or reducing the federal government relations advocacy contract. For administrative services, it means, because we are a service department, it looks like we would be having some reductions in staff. Within general administrative services includes, on the general fund side, finance and human resources. So it will be an equivalent of 4.0 FTEs, but that doesn't come without service level reductions. There's a lot of work that we're doing that is very important. It's not mandated or legally mandated, but we do these kind of things so we can have these types of conversations about our finances and such. There would be some reductions. I would want to say, you know, we're looking at expenditure reductions, but a good portion of our professional services is audit and banking fees. So right now we've got a lot of banking fees, and these are not banking fees for putting money in the bank or doing transactions with the bank. It's for credit card acceptance. Credit card acceptance is $36,000 of our budget. So one thing, if we're going to be creative, do we want to pass those fees on to the users? For human resources, there's a lot of things that human resources is doing. One of the big programs that was initiated, I believe that was last year, was the equity team. So there would be some reductions in that area. We also have things that we're doing from a human resources perspective to prevent or mitigate, you know, any of these potential personnel, employment issues. There are some impacts to discretionary funds. So the work that you see in the quarterly financial reports, the detailed budget documents, we're not required to do that. Even the CAFR, we're not required to. Just from a discretionary point of view, discretionary function, we've added those things. They've become useful to the city, but those would have to be reduced as well if we were to do a 4 FTE cut. From the administrative services also is responsible for the non-departmental. So some areas that would be impacted right now, we've got about $15,000 for the Connections magazine. You've seen in the city manager's budget, a reduction to 8 pages would probably reduce the postage for that. We would also look at reducing membership budget. We have 2 big memberships, and that's for Association of Washington Cities and the PSRC. And I don't need to read what those impacts are because I think you are very knowledgeable of those 2 areas. In the internal service fund, we could reduce our risk management, you know, looking at 20%, that means reducing our insurance coverage. And that means we'll have higher deductibles, which means if there's an incident, we end up paying more on the deductible side. I don't know what the trade-off would be at this point without changes in what we do. Fleet and equipment, we could reduce or defer maintenance. Now, if it were to be that some of these items that you see later, like in the police budget, if we were to reduce some of those programs, then naturally the fleet and equipment budget would be impacted. Information technology, in addition to the 4 identified in administrative services, would be an additional equivalent 2 FTEs in information technology. And the reason why I chose the FTE portion, I'm not sure that it's better than any other line item, but you know, times are changing. Cybersecurity is a big issue, and we have a lot of programs in place to try to detect these things. There definitely will be impact to services, including public safety, with reductions in information technology. Community and economic development, the way that I looked at this is they are bringing in revenues. So their percentage should be reduced by the amount of revenues that they're taking in. This target reduction would be $187,000 and would result in 1.5 FTEs. Now, the key one is going to be economic development manager. Basically, we've got Becky Newton, who does economic development with some help from Tiffany Spears. But that program could eventually, I mean, just, it wouldn't be existent without a manager position. And then we have an FTE for administrative assistant who does work on LHAB, and this is a shared position. So This is on the CD side, but this position is assigned to boards and commissions meeting preparation. That means that work would need to be reallocated within the existing staff. Parks, recreation, and cultural services, similar to administrative services, they have funds in the general fund, and that is the net amount of revenues coming in. And then street O&M has 340,000 and property management. So in the general fund, this would be equivalent to 2.5 FTEs. And again, those positions would be determined. This is all of the stuff that I'm telling you is from a 10,000 foot level. We'll need to go in and dig a little bit deeper. But recreation programs that would be eliminated or reduced would be the youth services, night market, Summerfest, and senior services. I grouped those all together under recreation as opposed to the maintenance side. On the maintenance side, there would definitely be reductions of service levels at the neighborhood park, sports field, because we'll have less temporary help, small tools and equipment for maintenance, and irrigation. So really don't irrigate anything else except for Fort Steilacoom Park. Then we'd also reduce the raw materials for and supplies for gravel, soil, flowers and seeds, and fertilizer. On the street O&M side, there would be reductions similar to parks maintenance, but focused on the street side. So irrigation, again, you'll see, and street lights, reducing, how much lighting we do, and it'll impact those service levels for my Lakewood 311. On the property management side, we've got just under 2.0 FTEs assigned to property management. And that would mean eliminating an equivalent of 1.0 FTE. It would also reduce some of the operating supplies. We'd also be looking at delaying capital maintenance, but as you know, delays in capital maintenance could have an impact later, a more costly impact. And the capital maintenance, primarily those funds are from the general fund. For public works engineering, the target reduction is about 140,000. And what our Public Works Engineering Director is looking at is really shifting the general fund support, paying for personnel and allocating that to SWIM. They're already also looking at, the allocations to the CIPs to see if they can recover some of those costs from grants. And then it would also include various line item budget reductions, such as non-mandatory training and travel. They do have temporary help in the baseline budget for pavement and database management and consultant for traffic counts, supplies, tools, and equipment. Those would all need to be reduced. So then what would happen if we didn't provide the funding for capital projects of 700,000 from the general fund to the CIP? For parks, it would mean eliminating project support. We have Doug Frazier, who helps out on project management of Parks CIP. That would probably have to be shifted over, or it would give us an opportunity to review some of the functions between the departments. Maybe that's an area that Public Works Engineering could cover. If the playgrounds were broken down or resurfacing is needed, we just wouldn't be able to do that, and we would just put up a sign, boarded up and not in use. For the transportation side, really, the budget includes so many positions that are funded by CIP. And there's about 8 positions, but we provide funding of just over $500,000, $550,000 or so. But if we didn't have that, where would we put those people? That means probably we would need to put more money into the project, so increases our project costs. We would have less oversight of the projects. And there's quite a few different impacts. For project specific, that means, general fund is providing some funds to the Steilacoom Boulevard project. So, there's already work that's been done. We'll have an impact on this project. Legal department identified target reduction is just under 340,000. This does involve 1.5 FTEs. One of them being at the front desk, which is something that we've been talking about. Why do we need people coming to City Hall? Eliminating an office assistant and reducing 1.0 assistant to 36 hours. So there will be some impacts to Public Records Act. And then eliminating, and I think all departments are doing, I think we are just changing our philosophy or our practices if it's non-essential. There are other means of obtaining training, whether it's required or non-essential. There's WCIA provides free training. We pay for it through our assessments. And then just with the agencies and organizations that we belong to, sometimes provide free training. Municipal court target reduction is $323,000. And what's not included in here for the offset is public defender, as the judge feels that this is separate from what the court services provides. But it does include reductions to FTEs. We would be reducing a judge, the court administrator time, and the 5 court clerks would be reduced by 30%, eliminating 2 code compliance officers. And then we have professional services and other charges for the different types of monitoring, jail sentence alternatives. Police department is an area that is the largest cut. And the reduction here is almost $5.2 million. That is quite a few number of positions. So in addition to the FTEs that are associated with each of these programs, it would involve eliminating a lieutenant. We would not have a special operations unit that eliminates 7 FTEs. It would eliminate the traffic unit, so we wouldn't have a dedicated traffic enforcement, and that would be a reduction of 8.0 FTEs. We'd eliminate something that we've been working on for a number of years, is the CSRT program, which includes code enforcement and community policing, community services officers, and that's 11 FTEs. We would close the lobby of the police station. Not that it would necessarily save, have a budgetary savings, but that's just kind of goes along with all of the other changes here. And then also eliminating the property proact investigative unit, and that's 8.0 FTEs. So I've also included other funds, and part of it is, AWC has expressed our support of legislation that will allow some flexibility for the use of these funds for general purposes if we ever got to that point. The first one, street O&M fund, I included that to show that the change in the motor vehicle fuel tax, that decrease causing general fund to provide more subsidy. The real estate excise tax, this one here could help us with the operational shortfall, revenue shortfall. And so, the 1.8 million that you see here in the revised budget, that is already a discounted budget. And so you don't see it decrease very much in the 2020 year end. I had mentioned the past couple of years, we've been averaging more like 2.5 million in revenues. Lodging tax here, Councilmember Boki had asked the question. This here is we're spending the prior year's revenues for the next year's allocation. And that concludes my presentation. And you're muted, Mayor.
Yeah, I had to pull the button down. We've got a lot of detail and you've done a great job, but could you take us back to the 50,000 foot level for a minute, back to your, early on, you had a FTE chart over the years.
Okay, sure. I'm sorry, I should have just pulled up the council packet so I could return to the agenda, but okay, this one here.
Yeah. Yes. So, well, I'm having trouble here. Okay. So where? FTE history.
Yeah.
The total is
212.75 in 2022.
Yeah, the total is the black on top.
Yes.
Correct. So I would like to point to the fact that when we hit the recession, I think council was a bit in the dark as to FTE cuts that hadn't taken place. And by not taking earlier action, we ate into the reserves substantially. So I just request that to confirm that, could you create a graph that shows FTEs and in comparison, the size of the reserve?
So I will say that we did not, are you talking about the current reserves?
Yes,
Okay.
the then current reserves, going back historically.
Okay.
Because when we changed city managers, I don't think our reserve was nearly as robust as it is now. And you'll see that it has developed over the years, but it's been after that 2014 to 15 drop of FTEs.
So I think I'm going to.
And that's really, my point is that I'm happy with the fact that there's a hiring freeze. You don't really have a lot of places to go because personnel costs are the main costs in the general fund and others. And so I'd like to see how that tracked back there. So when we're looking at how far to dip into our reserves, if at all, as a matter of policy, we can see what the historical impacts were of not reducing FTEs.
Will do.
Mr. Whalen.
You're on mute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, you missed nothing of substance in the last 10 seconds, so I'm fine. My question is, none of us, of course, wants to see us go into option 1 or 2 or 3 if we can avoid it. But we're going to be looking at something that's going to be different, certainly in the future. My question is, as we look at the FTE numbers that the mayor pointed out, one wonders if we can think about a new way of community policing in a sense. I'm looking at some statistics from some other jurisdictions about cities and general average officers per 10,000 population. And, I'm sure this stuff is all over the board, but one particular governing document I'm looking at talks about 15.9 average officers per 10,000 population, with cities between 50 and 100,000. So I wonder if that puts us around 95-ish, what we would look like saving economic development, those FTEs, and perhaps the planning FTEs, if we reallocated maybe 4 FTEs worth in the police department to efforts that sustain and grow our economic base, so we can bring the budget back to where hopefully it can be by attracting and retaining business in the community. I throw it out there for general discussion because nothing's in stone, of course, right now. But we've done some great work over the course of years of incorporation. Lakewood's policing has done yeoman's work by reducing crime dramatically, to the point maybe now we can take a new look at how we can best utilize those resources and save some other significant resources for economic development and other programs for the city.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing
Don, Mayor.
Yeah, I can't see everybody at once because the screen share's on. So I'm looking for the electronic hands, but I hear Mr. Bulkey. There you go.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. So Ms. Kraus, just to make sure there's no, so we clear up any confusion, on one page, it would be page 20 of the presentation, 558 in our packet. There are currently 12.5 FTEs vacant. And are those all in the general fund and what you consider to be general fund related?
Yes.
Okay. And so then the next page, and I'm assuming the 21-22 budget reduction options by department, which is the the full Monty, so to speak, the reduction of 55.4 FTEs, we can take out the 12.5 that are already open. So we're really at about 42.9 or 43 FTEs we need, according to this, would need to reduce.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Caulfield.
I'd just like to point out real quick that the table that Councilmember Boki just referred to, that's that 20% cut highly on, based on what we know right now, we probably won't need to go 20%, but we just wanted to go through that exercise. Based on what we know right now, it would probably be about 15 or 16%. But again, the answer to Councilmember Boki's question is, yeah, those existing 12.5 would be applied to whatever that number is, which is right now 52.
All right.
I'm sorry, 55.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Well, thank you, Ms. Kraus, I think. Well, thank you for all the hard work, not for the tenor of the news, but exceptionally well detailed and well thought out. Yeah, we all appreciate your talents, and then helps us make difficult decisions. So we move on to reports by the city manager, Mr. Caulfield.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Council. Just some updates. So you might have heard that Pierce County, DEM, along with the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department, is looking to submit to the State Department of Health to be able to move to phase 3 here in the next week or 2 or 3, which is a good sign. At the same time, you probably heard and seen that there has been a spike in COVID-19 cases, throughout the state, particularly on the east side. One of the questions, that we wanted to ask was, could, right now we're in phase 2, but could Department of Health, State Department of Health move us back to phase 1? The short answer on that is yes. However, the State Department of Health does look at a wide range of metrics. So based on how Pierce County currently is situated, highly unlikely that's going to happen. Thus the motivation to try and move forward to phase 3. So hopefully that'll happen in the near future. And then shortly thereafter, later this summer, we'll be able to, hopefully as a county, be able to move to phase 4. Later this week, actually, we're finalizing the application. We're going to submit to the Office of Economic Adjustment at the federal government, our Defense Community Infrastructure Program grant. And in summary, it looks like the grant amount that we will be submitting for is $9.5 million. And of course, that's for our what we call the JBLM North Access Project, which connects that Northgate Road out to Edgewood, Washington Boulevard, Gravely Lake Drive up to the I-5 interchange. We also are in the process of getting a letter of endorsement from JBLM. So we've been going back and forth on that in wordsmithing. And so we'll have that shortly as well. In addition, we've been in contact with Congressman Derek Kilmer. Actually, he reached out to us. He is looking at introducing an amendment as part of the current federal budget negotiations that the DSEP program is to be focused mostly, if not all, on infrastructure, which would be like road projects, water, sewer, things like that. In that the project match be reduced from 50% to 30%. Of course, we think that's a great idea, and we passed on to Mr. Kilmer and his office that we would certainly wholeheartedly support that. On the other end, you might remember last week, I reported to you that we had been in contact with Congressman Larson in his office regarding the House Transportation Bill Invest Act that had been dropped a couple of weeks ago. And we had worked with him and a number of other cities here in the Puget Sound region for him to drop an amendment that would create a set aside for medium-sized cities such as Lakewood, and again, a number of in the Puget Sound region. We learned mid last week that unfortunately Mr. Larson is not able to do that because of opposition from the chair on the various committees that this would have to go through. However, he is asking that our letter requesting this set aside be entered into the record so that the committee members can see that and see that there is still a request there. And then he is also committed to continue to work with us in the coming year on that. Regarding the CARES money, council, you approved the allocation of the COVID CDBG monies about a month ago or so. And late last week, we did launch the website as well as the application in multiple languages for businesses, eligible businesses to begin to apply for that. Likewise, we are now working on the website and the various applications that are needed for the larger $1.79 million that the state provided us. And we hope to get that up here in the next week or two. Our census committee continues to work with the community, particularly in the underserved areas where we've had challenges in the past in getting folks to respond to previous census. Here in Lakewood, we've got a 62% response rate, which is actually pretty good, puts us above the 50% in state of Washington, the percentile there. Pleased to note that two of our census tracts, Tillicum and Woodbrook, followed by Springbrook, are doing a whole lot better than they did 10 years ago. And again, a reflection on our census committee, working with various community advocates and of course the federal census team and getting the word out and getting people to participate. The farmers market, Mary Dodsworth asked that I pass along to you that actually it was a grand success. They were actually anticipating a bit of a slow start. However, there was a surge right at the beginning when it kicked off last Friday at 3 p.m. And then it was a very, very steady flow throughout the afternoon till about 7 p.m. The food truck lines were, the lines were long. There was actually a 30-minute wait. The number of vendors they had 28 vendors. They had 11 farmers and flower vendors, 9 processors, 8 food trucks. So did very well there. Sales were up 11% compared to opening day last year, and last year was a record high. So overall, the farmers market was very, very well received. Also, this year's sales was with 10 less vendors. One of the things that they're going to begin doing next week is actually eliminate the drive-through. The reason being is because while people liked it, very, very few people actually used it. And so that's something that we're going to do away with next week. And we reached out to the vendors and others on that, and they too concurred that they were okay with that. Also, late last week, the State Department of Revenue released their revenue forecast. And I know you just heard from Ms. Kraus on where we are financially. So in the current biennium, the state is projected to lose $8.8 billion. I was on some conference calls last week and some state legislators were participating in that. They actually commented that they were a little bit relieved and that they thought it was going to be much worse than that. But they also pointed out the same things that we have been saying, is that, there's still more empirical data and evidence to come in before that's surely what the number is going to be. Because again, we are all in uncharted territory on this. The governor has taken a number of actions in regards to the state budget, actually no different than what cities are doing, and to include the city of Lakewood in terms of trying to pause expenses and things along those lines. It looks like there will be a special session sometime in July or August. It is likely to only be for a few days, and it is likely simply to focus on making changes to the budget given the loss of revenue that the state is projected to lose. At the same time, Association of Washington Cities will be bringing forward, their initiatives, and they continue to have discussion with legislators to allow for cities to have revenue flexibility and some other areas like that. Getting back to the fact that we're in phase 2, if you drive around the city, particularly in the town center, about Wednesday of last week, a lot of our major retailers began to open up because they could. And what you're seeing now is not just full parking lots, but lines outside the stores. On Friday afternoon, actually beginning on Friday morning, Burlington Coat Factory had a line going around the corner, Bed Bath & Beyond, Marshall's, and some of the other stores. And that has continued over the weekend and into today as well. So hopefully, knock on wood, that's a good sign. There's certainly a pent-up demand that people weren't able to get out there and get goods and services. So hopefully that'll have a positive impact in our bottom line for the latter part of second quarter and third quarter. Also, Mary Dawsworth wanted me to pass along to you that the summer concert series lineup has been announced. It's on the website. They're going to begin on Thursday, July 16th and run through August 27th at the Fort Steilacoom Park at the Park in the Pavilion. And they're going to be from 6:30 p.m. to 8 p.m. Our transportation projects continue to move along, particularly Onyx and Veterans Drive are in full construction. Steilacoom Boulevard, they overlaid last week, and so the striping will occur here in the next couple of weeks. Probably the best shape that road has been in a long time. Also, pavement patching continues throughout the street, particularly along Custer and 112. So if you haven't been out there, those roads get a bit of a facelift. Also, our chip seal program will kick off on July 6th. And also sometime in July, we have a contract with Pierce County to do striping throughout the city. So that work will get underway as well in the next couple of weeks. And then lastly, we were contacted by the Tacoma Pierce County Economic Development Board earlier this afternoon. And the State Department of Commerce has been contacted by the U.S. Air Force. Actually, our good friend, the Honorable John Henderson, who's the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. And many of you might recognize him. He has been a key advocate for the city of Lakewood in addressing and helping find solutions to the North Clear Zone. But it's his office that is spearheading identifying the permanent location for the U.S. Space Command, which I think you're all aware just recently got set up earlier this year. And right now, they're defining the provisional headquarters will continue to be in Colorado Springs. However, over the next 3, 4, 5 years, even 6 years, they're looking for where should the permanent location be. One of the key criteria is that it needs to be within 25 miles of an existing military installation. Long story short, we were contacted to see if there was a location in Lakewood. Based on our very preliminary review of the criteria, we believe that, for example, the Lakewood Landing area meets that. And so we are going to submit a letter to that effect. It's due on Wednesday. And then the State Department of Commerce will then pass that on to the governor. And then the governor himself will then determine whether or not he endorses Lakewood as a potential community to be considered for U.S. Space Command. So definitely some more to follow on that. I'm sure there's going to be a number of communities throughout the continental United States competing for that. So I just want to try and manage expectations. But again, we will certainly pursue it because one never knows what happens once you get in the queue. So with that, that's my report. Thank you.
Questions for the city manager? All right, we'll go to Council, Ms. Moss.
Mr. Mayor, I was just curious, Mr. Caulfield, have you heard anything more on Bed Bath & Beyond closing?
I heard nationally that they're having troubles. I don't know why, because I am a dedicated customer there, and just based on what I spend there, they should not be closing. That's all I'm going to say on that. Actually, in all seriousness, we have not heard any rumblings about them leaving the town center. But again, nationally, like a lot of retailers, they are struggling. They are struggling. But again, no notification from RPAI that they plan on leaving our location. Actually, my gut instinct says that if any of the stores do survive, I would expect the one here to stay. One of the reasons that they are there is because of JBLM, and you have a turnover of troops every 2 years or so with new families, and Bed Bath & Beyond is a very popular location for folks to come for household goods as they are either coming into the community or leaving the community. So that's a bit of a bright spot, but I guess at this point in time, to be determined.
It's one of my favorites as well.
And the lights are on because John buys enough Dunkin' Donuts coffee to keep him afloat. Ms. Farmer.
In your city manager's email, you had mentioned the updated action on the QFC, the old QFC building. And in layman's terms, what does the ratification of the hearing examiner what does that mean?
Thank you for that question. Long story short, the summary judgment motion that our attorneys have filed, we're basically asking the judge to direct the property owner to follow the hearing examiner's ruling, which is to demolish the building.
Gotcha. I was hoping that's what you were going to say. My second question is, and I don't know if Becky is around, but there's a KinderCare on Phillips that has been vacant for a very long time, and there's been some action there recently, and I didn't know if it had been bought. Don't know if we know.
Offhand, I don't, but I can. We can find out.
Okay. Thank you.
And you said the location of that, council member? I'm sorry.
It's on Phillips.
Phillipsburg. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Caulfield? Then we'll go to council. Oh, Mr. Simpson covering up his camera with his hand.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a light-hearted note here and a question for the city council for Heidi. Does Bed Bath & Beyond used in the same sentence with City Manager John Caulfield, is that an oxymoron that we should consider adding to city statute?
You know, I learn new things about our city manager every week, and it's usually here in these meetings. He shares his true self with you, and it gives me an opportunity to get to know him just a little bit better. And
well, we certainly have heard the soft side. Thank you very much.
Put a thought down pillows and move to council comments. Ms. Farmer.
I don't have much other than I went out of town for the first time in 4 months, and I missed the opening of the farmers market, and I'm super excited to go next week and every week thereafter. And I'm sad to be working from home, but I'm happy to be working from home so that I can actually participate in the farmers market, because working in Olympia has not facilitated me to partake. So I'm super excited.
Mr. Bulkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First, the farmer's market was great. I ended up getting there late Friday afternoon and bought some produce, and it was great and very well attended. And I would agree with the comments by the city manager a little earlier that a lot of people just parked and walked. You know, hopefully everyone was socially distancing, but I thought it looked great. And I'll echo his comments on Stilicho Boulevard. It does look nice that it is finally repaved after all these years, and hopefully we can get the sidewalks in. And I did see the patching guys on Custer. I think they've moved on, but they did the first day or two, they did the bulk of their work, I think, on Custer. And so they got some sections done there. And it looks better. It still needs work, and so hopefully someday we'll get everything together. And I appreciate staff's work on the budget. I really do. They did a lot of analysis, and it's up to us to see how things work. And we'll also kind of just, I guess, I think we're like a lot of people, and we're a lot of groups. We're just waiting it out to see if Congress is going to do anything. If Congress doesn't do anything, we'll pretty much all be in the same boat. So hopefully in the next 60 days, we'll have a little bit more clarity. So thank you.
Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have much to say, but I will say this. I found a new way to get out of Oak Brook today from my house, because everywhere I went was construction. So I came out from my gate and I turned by the clubhouse, and came out. So I bypassed it, but it looks nice. People are commenting about the sidewalks and curbs and gutters going in. So they're proud of it, but they are on pins and needles for it to get done. So, but everything's going good. I like the way it's looking. Thank you.
And I commend you. I think I've lived in Lakewood over 30 years now, and I'm never sure how to get out of it. Mr. Simpson.
No, Mr. Mayor, I'm fine. Thank you.
Mr. Branstetter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just wanted to wonder if we given any thought as to how we would utilize next Monday, which is the 29th, and it's a fifth Monday, but you know, on the calendar of council things, it was tentatively said that we would relook at some of the things we looked at tonight in terms of budget and the police. But, you know, I do think if we're looking to make some use of that time, that, you know, we need to be thinking just beyond police use of force and police relationship in the community, and talking about the equity issues that are more broadly in the community. And really, are there some things that we could do? And that may be an opportunity for us to get together, not with a presentation or anything to consider, but to consider each other's thoughts.
I would welcome comments by other council members. I hadn't heard other council members clamoring for an extra meeting. And with such gravity attached to the discussion you suggest, I would hope we had more time to prepare and actually have some sort of organization and facilitation. But I'll leave it up to my cohorts. Any comments?
I think, yeah, I think it would be good to have some time to do it. My preference would be when we have a chance, not only to have a facilitated discussion with some advanced prep, but also some in-person time, because I think we would glean more with sitting around a table with each other and seeing each other again, and having that chance with a mini retreat type style.
And I think we'll have some more guidance on Open Public Meeting Act here pretty soon, and we may have the opportunity to spread out with some public participation and do like you suggest. So that'd be, I guess, my present. Mr. Simpson.
Yes, I'd just like to add on, Mr. Mayor, that while I think Mike's idea is a good idea, I would prefer that it would be face-to-face, where we sit and we talk, we discuss, sort of a roundtable discussion about this. And that's my 2 cents worth.
Okay. Well, looks like we'll try to find time for that. And I ask the city manager to try to think about how that would best be facilitated. It might be helpful for it to have somebody from outside instead of just a staff person, even given our budget constraints. Somebody who has some subject matter knowledge.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I definitely see that that's a topic that we can get better results from a face-to-face discussion amongst ourselves than one in this format.
So,
and that's all I have.
Okay, we'll try to work that into the plan then. I think Mr. Whalen is next.
Yes, I've heard nothing. I didn't get a chance to go to the farmer's market on Friday. I had some other obligations, but I've heard nothing but great comments from those who did go. They love the Friday time slot because folks who work during the day have a chance to really enjoy it with their families between 3 and 7. So kudos for the time and date change. I think it could be a winner, and I hope it goes well for the rest of the summer. On Thursday, I attended the Pierce County Regional Council meeting, where principally the Transportation Coordinating Committee's recommendations were brought forth for funding for 2023 and 2024. Lakewood received funding for preservation for the South Tacoma Way 96 to Silicon Boulevard overlay project to the tune of about $750,000. I think part of that's 2023 award for design city manager, is that correct? And the rest would be construction in the following year. So there was a little bit of discussion by the chair of the committee in his cover letter. He responded to Lakewood's request to obtain the scoring sheets from the committee members, which is kind of an unusual request. It had not been done apparently in the many, many years they've been doing this, but it's a proper request because we made it through the auspices of a public records request because apparently we didn't get good cooperation up front. And so the chair wanted to bring before the whole Pierce County Regional Council a motion to request that the organization, the body, formally request that Lakewood withdraw its public disclosure request, which a few of us said, that's kind of interesting. That's a little bit challenging for an organization to actually take action on. And after a little bit of comment between myself and one of the council members from Tacoma, Catherine Ushka, that quickly died as a thought topic by the body of the whole. So we apparently, Mr. Caulfield will be getting some of those scoring sheets. And again, the purpose articulated by our staff and me as well at the meeting was we really just want to learn how to do better, how the scoring review process works once the criteria is in place, and how we can look at those categories and better posture our projects to better meet the categories in the future. So it was a very legitimate request, and I assume from the fact that we push back a little bit on Mr. Blunt that we will receive those scoring sheets and we'll get the education we wanted. Other than that, unless Mr. Caulfield has any follow-up on that, it was an uneventful meeting, but at least we got a little bit of skin in the game coming out of the 2023-24 monies. And that's all I had to report.
Thank you. I have actually one comment that's down in the weeds. I have occasion at least once a week to go to the American League Veterans Hospital and campus, and I noticed with great interest the progress on the street project. But I also noticed other changes in the landscape from time to time, and there is one house that is close to the entrance. It's on the side away from the lake that is for sale, and it's pretty obviously a flip. It's an older house. It's been all dolled up. It looks quite nice, but at the same time, they inexplicably extended the front yard fence and improvements out about 15 to 20 feet into the right of way, so that it's all going to have to be cut off. If you look at the layout of the street, everyone else clear back to the park has pretty good compliance with the property line. So obviously somebody didn't know what they were doing. I would suggest, if it hasn't been done already, that notice go to the owner of the property so that they need to disclose it to any potential buyer. I don't feel too sorry for somebody who didn't do their due diligence and made improvements to public property in a flip, but I would hate to see it an innocent owner unnecessarily find that they didn't get to keep the improvements that they thought they were paying for. On COVID-19 status in the county, applying for phase 3, there's trends in number of cases upward, positive test results, but it's positive test results. And that is probably, although it's top of mind with respect to the governor's criteria and with respect to the news media, it's probably the least reliable and accurate of 4 measures of the impact of the disease. The one that's the most accurate is deaths. That's a very objective event, a very sad one. The next one is hospitalizations. Somebody's in the hospital and tests positive. The medical establishment can pretty well track that as an objective fact. So they're pretty good, accurate numbers on that. The next two, the next most accurate is percentage of positive tests. That's been tracking pretty even, but it too is subject to variables because that's who you're testing. If you test a population that's been pretty isolated, you probably get a low percentage. If you decide to test a nursing home, you're probably going to have a higher number. So then you get to the least reliable one, which is the one we use, which may or may not have it. It has a general relationship, but that's the new positive cases. And that is directly proportional to the number of people that you test. And testing's gone up. And we don't have the numbers to show how those interrelate right now. We'll try to get them. But that's just something to watch as you see whether we can come out of phase 2 into phase 3 on some rather arbitrary criteria, but they're flexible. So it may be that I don't know. It may be that while positive tests are going up, that those first 2 hospitalizations and deaths are staying flat. It's just that we're finally getting testing ramped up to an appropriate level. So it's all in a state of flux. The way the timeline is set out, the county probably cannot apply until about July 6th, and would be an application date because of the way the sequence is set up by the state. So more to come. Is there any other business to come before the council? Seeing none, we're adjourned. Good night.
Good night.